we are here today to start week 2 of the Science and Faith Virtual Symposium. So thank you very much for joining us. Just a few technical things really quickly here. You can go to the top right of your screen and hit view, and you should be able to hit pin speaker mode, and that will allow you to see the speaker in the presentation full screen mode. So that should help you out with your viewing experience there. We also have audio and video for participants disabled right now, just because we want to be able to keep things going in order, but we will have questions and answers dispersed throughout the presentation for this particular presentation. So type questions you have in the chat, and then we'll have a general question and answer at the end as well. We will also be posting a link in the chat toward the end of the presentation to a Google form. So if you're an NC State student that's attending this for diversity credit, make sure you record your attendance on there. And if you also want to find out more information from Christian Veterinary Mission or Ratio Christi, you can fill out that form as well, and you can order a t-shirt through there as well. So that is all that. We do ask that in the chat you keep your questions as questions directed toward the speaker instead of just comments about the general presentation, just because we don't want to distract people from the presentation that is occurring. So please keep that in mind. Yeah, and we will have a brief break at the end of this session before we start our panel at about 2:30. So what is the history of science and religion? Wasn't Galileo imprisoned because he went against the Bible for teaching that the Earth was not at the center of the solar system? Did people of faith believe that the vastness of the universe harmed religious belief in human significance? After all, didn't the church try to suppress the scientific revolution? And if science and religion had been in conflict since the beginning, what hope could there be for them to get along in the future? Exploring this topic with us today is Dr. Michael Keas. He has a PhD in the history of science and has won research grants from the National Science Foundation, Fulbright, and Discovery Institute. Dr. Keas serves as a lecturer in the history and philosophy of science at Biola University and is on the board members of Ratio Christi. He has numerous publications, including his book, 7 Myths About the History and Future of Science and Religion, which we'll be giving away a free copy of at the end of the session today, and a very popular essay on the traits that make a good theory in the philosophy journal Synthase. Welcome to the symposium, Dr. Michael Keas.
Great to be here. Welcome to everyone else as well. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So we go from here, right? I start my presentation?
Yes, you are good to go.
All right. Well, I taught for about a quarter century college students and taught them about science and how it relates to different other aspects of culture. And I kept running across these stories that made Christianity look anti-science. And as I began to dig deeper into these stories, I found out that most of them were myths, simply fake news, if you will, about the past. So I wrote a book about it called Unbelievable, 7 Myths About the History and Future of Science and Religion. So let's run through some of these myths and see if you've encountered any of them. And I'll pause for questions after a couple of these myths before we get to the very end and have more questions, more opportunity for questions. Okay, so Neil deGrasse Tyson, probably the world's leading scientific communicator, perpetuates quite a few of these myths. Be on the lookout for him. First myth I called the big myth. It's the idea that a big universe has become a problem for Christianity. Bill Nye expresses the myth well. He once said, "I'm insignificant. I'm just another speck of sand. And the Earth, really in the cosmic scheme of things, is another speck. And the sun, an unremarkable star. And the galaxy is a speck. I'm a speck on a speck, orbiting a speck, among other specks, among still other specks, in the middle of specklessness. I suck!" And that's roughly how he said it in front of the American Humanist Association, where he was receiving an award. Later in this same talk, he goes on to say that humans are significant because we can do science, but when he says I suck, really what he means is religion sucks, or the religious basis for human significance has no basis to it. That's the claim. And so I'm going to argue Bill Nye. And there's an article I just published about this, and if you Google my last name, which sounds like car keys almost looks like chaos, K-A-S. So if you Google Keas scientism, you'll find an article published in a journal called Religious. In fact, it just appeared yesterday. And I cover some of the myths we're talking about today in that article and relate it to scientism, which is the belief that science is the only kind of knowledge that's reliable. Um, and I know how that falls apart. I build on the work of J.P. Moreland, who's written a great book on scientism, but also show how these stories that I am going to debunk, many of them have a scientific component to them, and that by perpetuating bad history, that is inaccurate history, a lot of people are also promoting scientism. I'm a big proponent of science, of course. Science is a wonderful thing, but scientism is a distortion of the genuine limits of what science can do and saying that it's the only reliable knowledge. Um, so Bill Nye thinks that humans, in any traditional sense, are significant. We couldn't be an important part of God's divine plan because of how small we are, and so he equates our smallness with our insignificance. But later on in the presentation, he does say, well, we are significant because look, we figured this out. We are scientists, we have figured out many things about the cosmos, and so we must be significant in some sense. Um, Now, part of the myth is that Christians and religious people in the past thought the Earth uh, very, very big compared to a small cosmos, um, and only modern science showed that the cosmos is much, much bigger than the Earth. Uh, but if you go back into history, you'll find that there are in ancient Hebrew literature clear indications that ancient Hebrews believed in a very big universe. Now look at this quote from Psalm 103. For as high as the heavens are of the earth, so great is his steadfast love toward those who fear him. Now, what stands behind this statement? Is it the belief that the universe is big or the universe is small? Okay, everyone think about that. Now, the comparison, of course, is between God's love and the size of the universe. So if God's love is great, his steadfast love, then of course what stands behind the text is the idea that the universe was also thought to be very, very large. Um, the uh, ancient Greeks also had this view, and they had scientific reasons for believing in a big universe. Here's the famous astronomer Ptolemy, who said that the Earth has to the senses the ratio of a point to the distance of the sphere of so-called fixed stars. Now, what he meant by that is the Greeks thought that all the stars were attached to one gigantic sphere. The Earth was in the middle, and what he just said in this quote is that the Earth is virtually dimensionless compared to the distance outward to the sphere of fixed stars that is around the Earth. And so that conveys the idea that the universe is very, very big. And he had some specific arguments for that. He didn't just state this, he argued for this. And these arguments, this conclusion, found its way in all the way through the Middle Ages, including in the medieval universities, where it was taught to hundreds of thousands of students during the so-called Dark Ages, when Christianity was so pervasive in society in Europe. But continuing on with the big myth, C.S. Lewis does a great job of debunking part of this myth as well. And he notes that humans in general just perceive space, whatever space actually is in and of itself, we perceive it to be three-dimensional, and it seems to have no boundaries. At least that's the way humans feel about it, and the way they write about it in poetry and in informal prose. And pre-modern Greeks and Christians, Jews imagined a very, very big cosmos. And some of them actually had scientific arguments for this, as I mentioned in the case of Ptolemy. So we didn't have to wait until the modern period to discover that the universe is large. There was a widespread belief among both religious and non-religious people throughout the ancient world, not everywhere, but particularly in the Western tradition, that the universe was very, very big. Now, Lewis also debunks kind of the the contemporary sort of logical options that are often posed to us by atheists, and as if they all terminate in the conclusion that there must not be a God. For example, one option of the logical options out there regarding the size of the universe and what this means for us is, what if it were the case that there were no objects visible to us except for the sun and the moon? Let's suppose that that's all that seems to exist. And the atheist easily, as Lewis notes, argue that this vast emptiness would certainly be used as a strong argument against God. What a bunch of wasted space, right? If there's all this seemingly, at least according to the human imagination, seemingly limitless amount of space, and if there was nothing out there, then atheists would easily say, well, what God would make all this space and put nothing in it? What a waste of space. Well, there's other possibilities too. As you look at the options, what if there are many objects out in space, which of course is actually the case? Then there's still a couple other logical possibilities as to what's out there. And as Lewis notes in his quote, they must either be habitable or uninhabitable. And the odd thing, and this is Lewis, and the odd thing is that both of these hypotheses are used as grounds for rejecting Christianity. So in other words, if there were billions and billions of habitable planets, then the atheists could easily argue, well, humans aren't special because we're lost in a crowd of aliens, right? Of all kinds of different alien intelligence creatures. Or if there are billions of objects out there and none of them, or almost none of them, are inhabited, or inhabitable or habitable, that is, if they're uninhabitable, then this could also be used as an argument against God, because the atheist could easily say, well, what a lousy design, all these planets out there and none of them seem suitable for life. What self-respecting God would create trillions of sterile planets? That's really lousy design. So the curious thing is that no matter how it might have been done, if God exists, no matter how he created the world, the universe, whether many objects or not, whether habitable or not, any one of these options could be used as a complaint against God for, well, therefore God doesn't exist. So what we have here really is game rigging, not truth seeking. It's a stacked deck of cards. No matter what hand you deal or are dealt, cosmically, the atheist is going to want to spin any outcome as a reason for rejecting God. And Lewis just points out that the whole thing is just subjective. There's really no objective, reliable truth seeking that's going on here. It's just playing an elaborate game. Godless stunts, if you will. So the first myth in my book is I call the big myth, and it's the idea that a big universe has become a problem for Christianity because modern science discovered the universe was big. Back in ancient, they thought it was small for religious reasons, and then science burst the religious bubble, and so on. But of course, we've just seen that ancient and medieval theologians and scientists knew the universe was really big. It's not a modern discovery, and furthermore, doesn't it seem very fitting that a God of infinite power would create a very big place with lots of things in it to express his power, to show his power? But again, regardless of the size and the contents of the universe, atheists are going to find some excuse for trying to spin it as if there is no God is the best conclusion. All right, how about the dark myth? So we just covered the big myth. How about the dark myth? That's the idea that the Christi. Well, actually, before I go to the dark myth, are there any questions about the first myth?
We do not currently have any questions in the chat.
Good, then I will continue on. If you have questions about any of these myths I've covered so far, put them in the chat, and at the end, I'll also allow time, but I'll pause several times for the talk in case someone has a question you want to pause to have addressed immediately. Okay, so the big myth. Second, the dark myth. Now that's the idea that Christian Europe was, because of the influence of the church, was responsible for 1,000 years of intellectual darkness. And so sometimes the medieval period is called the Dark Ages. Now, does this actually correspond to real history? Well, let's see. But first of all, here's an astronomy textbook that expresses the myth that in medieval Europe, no new astronomical investigations of importance were made, and that rather than turning to scientific inquiry, the medieval mind rested in acceptance of authority and absolute dogma. And this is typical of astronomy textbooks and popular science writing about the Middle Ages, the Christian Middle Ages. Now, the truth is that as the Roman Empire eventually fell apart and Christian Europe grew up in its place, that early Christians absorbed kind of a mediocre attitude towards science that the Romans had. They were interested in science, but eventually Christian Europe created a very science-friendly cultural matrix in which science flourished in an amazing way. So, and of course, when the Roman Empire broke up, there was just chaos for quite some time. And so for science as a cultural enterprise really flourish, it needs to have some degree of stability. And it took a while for Christian Europe to overcome the chaos of the breakup of the old Roman Empire. Now, St. Augustine, an early Christian intellectual who had immense influence throughout the Middle Ages, writing at kind of the transition from ancient world to medieval world, he wrote that we should proceed by certain reasoning or experience to discern how God had established what he called the nature of things. So, how do things work in the world? Well, we should reason about that, and we should have some experiences with those things in the world to try to figure out how God made them to work the way they work. And there were a whole slew of books published in the Middle Ages, of course, prior to the printing press, that were entitled something like The Nature of Things, with various variations off of that title. And they were putting into practice the kind of emphasis on both rational deliberation as well as using your senses to experience the world to try to make sense of it. For example, Roger Bacon in the High Middle Ages had experimented with the nature of light and was able to build on the earlier work of the Greek and Islamic scientists who had come up with some interesting theories about light. And this kind of work was supported by the church, including the papacy. That the universities were founded by Christians and the universities became a permanent home for science and mathematics. In fact, about a third of the medieval curriculum was devoted to science and mathematics for the general education of students. And there were hundreds of thousands of students that were educated in science and mathematics throughout Europe because it was required of all of them to get their undergraduate degrees. So this doesn't sound like Dark Ages, does it? Some of the sort of components of scientific methodology were also formulated to some degree in the Middle Ages. A logic that was friendly to science, that is, where you could start with probable premises and then reason to probable conclusions. And science often involves that, where you're gathering evidence about the world, and then you're trying to reason from that to what is the best explanation. And they also supported human dissections, another misconception that Christians were against cutting up dead human bodies to learn about anatomy. They actually had a protocol for that, where universities had these lecture halls where you would see the instructor cut up a body, and it was done, of course, all by a proper procedure. You had to find a dead criminal or something like that, procured legally. And the very idea of laws of nature also got a better grip during the Middle Ages. if God is the one who made the world and God is the supremely rational, then we should expect to be able to discern the way or the nature of things would behave in a regular way that could be discernible to the human mind, since the human mind was made in God's image. And so that was a very science-friendly kind of attitude. There's an atheist named Tim O'Neill who has a blog called History for Atheists. And even though he's an atheist, he sort of blows the whistle on the atheists who use history to try to make atheism look like, being on the right side of history. And the concept of the Dark Ages is central to several key elements in this new atheist bad history, as Tim O'Neill calls it. And he would agree with the things I've said so far about the so-called Dark Ages not being really dark. So the Dark Ages, as typically framed, just never happened. How about the third myth, the flat myth? This one's actually a component of the dark myth. And so we'll see if there's any questions after these first three myths, because they're all very interrelated. The flat myth is the idea that Christians in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat. This was one specific form of the dark myth. But it's worthy of its own story, because there's a lot to be learned from this misconception and what is the correct story in its place. Okay, so everyone just think, were you taught in school, grammar school, maybe junior high, middle school, that Europeans thought the earth was flat until Columbus proved it was round? When I polled my students for the years I taught, almost all of them said, yeah, that's what they were taught. That's actually not true. University students were required to learn the science about Earth's shape, and they learned good arguments for a spherical Earth. In fact, I want everyone to think just for the next 10 seconds, can you think of any one argument where you could go from something you could see, maybe you haven't seen, but you could see with your own eyes, and reason from those observations to the conclusion that Earth is spherical as opposed to, let's say, flat? Okay, everyone think about that. Can you think of an example? Give you a few seconds. All right, see if any of you came up with these. For example, during a lunar eclipse, the Earth's shadow that's cast on the moon is noticeably curved on its edge, showing that the object that's casting that shadow has at least some curvature to it. And that can be used to argue for a generally curved, that is spherical shape for Earth. Or how about this one? As you travel further north from where you are, for about every 1,000 miles you travel north, the North Star, called Polaris, will appear about 15 degrees higher above your horizon. So here's your horizon, and it will keep appearing higher and higher above your horizon as you go further and further north on planet Earth. When you finally get to the North Pole, of course, Polaris will appear directly over your head. That is 90 degrees above your horizon. And this can be used as an argument for, again, the curvature of the Earth, particularly the north-south curvature, that you're moving along a curved surface, which is giving you a different angle on that distant star. And medieval students were aware of this sort of thing. So these were apparently not Dark Ages after all, were they? Okay, so that's the third myth. I'm going to skip the Bruno myth, but are there any questions yet about the big myth, the dark myth, or the flat myth?
I think so far we mostly have comments. We had some guesses about the shadow on the moon and about the stars changing whenever you asked for what proof we might have of being on a round Earth. So we had some good guesses.
Oh, okay. Right. Did anyone come up with as a ship comes over the horizon on the water, that you see the top of it first before the bottom of it?
Yes, we had that one.
Okay, right. So I used to teach a lab component to my science course, which included the history and philosophy of science as well as contemporary science. And I have my students argue pro and con, flat Earth versus round Earth. And of course, there's good reasons to believe in a spherical Earth, but a lot of the students found themselves having a hard time arguing for a round Earth. I mean, they all believed in a round Earth, but if you were to pit the typical university student today versus a medieval student, I think you'd find that a medieval student would have better reasons for believing in a spherical Earth than most modern students. Now, of course, modern students have a lot more knowledge than medieval students do, but I'm just picking this as an example of where it's used to try to make Christianity look anti-science. And the fact is, medieval Europe was very science-friendly as a cultural context within which science could develop. Any other questions before we move on?
None so far.
Okay. Let's skip myth 4 about Bruno and go to myth 5. And this is the Galileo myth. And of course, Galileo did have a rather unfortunate encounter with his own church, the Catholic Church. But the myth says that he was imprisoned and tortured for his scientific proof, that he had proof, and the religious authorities, stuck their fingers in their ears and covered their eyes and didn't want to see this scientific proof. So that's the myth. Now I'll have to unpack this, and there was a lot of really interesting lessons from this about how to integrate science and theology today. Even though this issue is not debated so much anymore, although I've run into a few people that have still are sort of pre-modern in their views about a moving Earth versus a stationary Earth. But anyway, let's jump into this. Okay, so here are a few of the discoveries that Galileo made looking through his telescope, which he grounded his own lenses, by the way. He'd heard about a looking glass, as they called it. Someone in Northern Europe had invented it, but Galileo perfected the grinding of lenses to make a device that was good enough to actually point it up into the night sky and make some amazing discoveries, such as that Jupiter has moons. Looking with just the naked eye, you're not going to see the moons of Jupiter. But Galileo saw them. And, well, it wasn't a proof, but it wasn't an analogical argument, right? If Jupiter can go around the sun, according to the Copernican sun-centered moving Earth theory, the new theory that Galileo was promoting, if Jupiter can go around the sun and carry with it its own little satellites, its moons, then couldn't Earth also do that? Couldn't Earth have a moon going around it and the Earth could still be in motion? So again, it wasn't proof of a moving Earth, but it was suggestive that, or at least it made the idea of a moving Earth more plausible. Or how about this other discovery that Galileo made, that Venus has phases, kind of like our moon goes through, a crescent and then a wider until we get to finally full moon. Venus also goes through these phases, which people didn't notice until the telescope enabled them to do so. Now, I'll show you a diagram to explain why, but this did kill ancient astronomy, the Ptolemaic system, but it didn't prove the Copernican system, because there was another option between the traditional Ptolemaic view that was from the ancient Greek world, that was carried through the Middle Ages, through the universities, up to the time of Copernicus. Now we're talking early modern science, Copernicus and Galileo. The phases of Venus having phases just didn't make sense if the Ptolemaic Earth-centered system were true, but it didn't necessarily prove the Copernican theory, because there was another option called the Tychonic theory, put forward by a guy named Tycho Brahe. And this diagram shows the Tychonic view of system of the world. Notice that Earth is still considered in the center. It's in the center of that diagram, the little blue dot there. The sun was thought to still go around the Earth. Of course, that was consistent with the ancient Ptolemaic view that this Earth is at rest in the center of the universe. The sun goes around the Earth. But notice what's new here. Rather than all the other planets also going around a centered Earth, the other planets go around the sun, and they carry. So as the sun goes around the Earth, the sun also carries Venus with it, as well as Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, as they go around the sun. And if this system of the world were true, Venus would appear to go through all the phases that it does go through, that is, as shown through the telescope. So Galileo really didn't prove the Copernican system. This was a third option that was still viable at the time of Galileo. It took another generation later, at the time of Newton, when finally the Copernican system was well founded and the Tychonic system was shown not to be a possibility, or at least not a reasonable possibility. But the church really wasn't against science per se. Cardinal Bellarmine, who was the leading inquisitor of the Roman Inquisition, even once wrote that if somehow the Copernican theory could be proven, then, and here's the quote, one would have to proceed with great care in explaining the scriptures that appear contrary. So he was at least open to the possibility. He didn't think it was likely that the Copernican theory could be shown to be true through science, but if it could be, then the theologians would have to make sense of the Bible in light of that discovery. Now, we know the Bible does use ordinary observational language like sunrise and sunset, and Galileo and the church, much of the church, understood that that doesn't necessarily mean the Bible teaches a cosmology, that is a theory about what really moves and what's at rest. And in fact, the best Bible scholars today would agree with me and Galileo and actually much of the Catholic Church that the Bible was not intended by the Holy Spirit to teach knowledge about hidden mechanisms in the natural world, or what really is the true cosmology about the structure of the physical cosmos. The Bible, it does intend to teach that the universe was made by God, and it's not here by accident, but it's purposely made. But it uses ordinary observational language to describe nature, like sunrise and sunset. The funny thing is, Copernicus himself also used the terms sunrise and sunset, or even scientists today, in their informal moments, will refer to sunrise and sunset. Even in their formal moments, will still use this language, and it's not erroneous at all. It's just the way things appear, even though you're not claiming that the sun moves around the earth and the earth is stationary. You can still use this terminology because that's the way the appearance is. Galileo, the little quote that I skipped, Galileo, actually quoting another cardinal, wrote that the Bible teaches us how one goes to heaven, not how the heavens, not how the heaven goes. That is, not how the heavens or things in the heavens might be moving or not moving. The Bible wasn't intended to teach that. And if you want a really rigorous argument for this argument that the Bible is neutral on questions of cosmology other than God made the world, go to a guy named C. John Collins, his book, Reading Genesis Well. He's got some chapters on this that are in the latter part of his book that are quite good. And that's C. John Collins. So Galileo and the church agreed that the Bible's without error. It wasn't Galileo, the science, versus the church. Galileo was a good member of his own church, the Catholic Church, and he agreed the Bible was without error, and that science can find truth, and that somehow they're going to agree if, of course, and here's the big if you've correctly interpreted the text of nature and the text of Scripture, because you could possibly misinterpret one or both of these as God's revelation. But if you properly interpret God's general natural revelation about the universe and his special revelation in Scripture, then you should have no problem eventually seeing how these fit together in harmony. That was Galileo's view, and many within the church had this view. But there were some theologians who protested Galileo and disagreed with him on these points. But Galileo did not spend lengthy time in jail. He wasn't tortured, and he had fine lodging and food while he was under trial. Um, he was, however, found guilty of vehement suspicion of heresy. He had to get down on his knees and say he didn't believe this stuff anymore. And so the church, the Catholic Church, was guilty of overreach here, and it was an embarrassing episode for the Catholic Church. But it doesn't show any inevitable conflict between science and faith. Um, this could have turned out quite differently if the Pope hadn't been under such pressure to kind of politically because of various things that were happening, or if Galileo had showed some more modesty. He really did overstate his case for the Copernican, Earth moving view. But anyway, it is what it is. It's a sad ending. But this sad ending to Galileo's life, he was put under house arrest. He still wrote, still did science, but he was monitored more closely after this. And so the church was guilty of trying to overmanage or micromanage the work of scientists. The Catholic Church later said that Galileo actually got this right about science and faith, but anyway, it took a long time for that to happen. All right, that's the fifth myth. Are there any questions about that myth, or anything that provoked you to think about how to solve when maybe the Bible and the science appear to conflict? How do you deal with those apparent conflicts? Are there any questions of that sort yet?
We have
Yes.
two questions. Oh, sorry.
Nope, you're fine.
Sorry about that. We have two questions. The first, I think, is more related to what you were directly talking about. The second one we might leave for the general question and answer session. But as far as like the Bible's cosmology, we have a question. In the Genesis account, the Earth is created before the rest of the universe on day 4. Do you think this is one of the reasons the church used to assume that the Earth was the center of the universe, because the Earth was created before the rest of the universe on day 4?
Yeah, now day 4 talks about the sun, moon, and stars. So you got, and again, I recommend C. John Collins reading Genesis well in his earlier book, Genesis 1-4. It's a commentary. But the day 4 in the creation week talks about the sun, moon, and stars. But Earth, I mean, the opening of course, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What Collins thinks, and I agree with him, is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is the preface to the first story in the Bible, which is structured as a creation week narrative, and that there's an analogy between God working and resting and us working and resting. We work 6 days, we rest the seventh. But this analogy, in this analogy between God's working and resting and our working and resting, you have a story in which the preface says God made everything, the heavens and the earth, and that's a Hebrew way of saying everything, the cosmos, including the earth and all the sun, moon, and stars. But day 4 describes God appointing the function of the sun, moon, and stars for human purposes. So it's describing God's how God uses these for and how humans will use them for the ecclesiastical calendar, for example, knowing when to celebrate Easter, and eventually when with the Christian tradition. But the question about, was the earth, does the Bible claim the earth was created on day 4? I don't think so. And in fact, I don't even think the Bible claims that the sun, moon, and stars only occurred later, that the earth was made first. That's the way it's sometimes read. The earth was made first, and then later the sun, moon, and stars were made around it. That's, I think, a trying to press the biblical account into answering modern, more scientific questions. The point of the biblical text is the universe is not an accident. God made everything by speaking it into existence. And there's also room for development over time as God shapes things. He can create things from nothing, and he can shape things through time to make solar systems come into existence, and for the earth to appear in this solar system and to have its very unusual habitable traits. So so I think that the Genesis story is a true story that describes how God made everything, but there is this analogy between God working and resting, us working and resting, and analogies have similarities, but they also have differences. So not everything in the narrative is necessarily in chronological order. Some of the things in the narrative are for thematic reasons, kind of like how in the account of Jesus' temptation, Matthew and Luke record them in different order because at least one of them is thematically arranging them. And then you can have something like that going on in Genesis. So I think generally there are some chronological teachings in Genesis that humans were the last creation and that God was preparing the earth to be habitable for first single cell life and then later more complicated life and then finally humans. So there is some general chronological teaching in Genesis, but not everything in the ordering of the days is there for chronological reasons. Some of it is there for thematic reasons. So I think that kind of undercuts some of the misconceived ideas of trying to press Genesis into answering modern scientific questions that it wasn't designed to answer. God expected us to discover how stars behave and how stars come into how stars eventually have a life cycle and grow old, and how solar systems form and that sort of thing. It's all under God's sovereign plan, but he expected us to discover how these things work. They're not revealed in the Bible.
We have one more question. Hugh Ross shows how the major tenets of the Big Bang theory are described in Scripture. Do you think this is intentional or coincidental?
Yeah, Hugh Ross will refer to the text that talks about God stretching out the heavens like a tent. And I think that, again, if you read C. John Cullen's Reading Genesis Well, you'll find that this language is simply intended to convey not that the universe is expanding, that this space is expanding, but that God made the universe intentionally. It's not an accident, kind of like a human tent maker would make a place that would be suitable for human habitability on a small scale. God made a universe that would be life friendly when you get all the other local conditions just right to get a planet like Earth. I think sometimes well-meaning science apologists like Hugh Ross read into the biblical text something that's not actually intended to be taught. But I think that there's nothing in the Bible inconsistent with Big Bang cosmology. I think it's the best scientific theory that we have about the origin of the cosmos, and it implies uh, a cause that's beyond space, time, and matter, namely, which fits very well the biblical description of God. But I don't think the Bible was intended to teach that theory, but it's consistent with it. So I just would ask for caution when it comes to trying to make the Bible tell us more than what it actually does. So I'm very cautious about that because I think that's not a legitimate hermeneutical approach to the scriptures. Any more questions?
That's it for right now. We have one more,
Okay.
but it's more general, so we'll
More
ask
general.
at the end.
Got it. All right. Well, then let's move on to myth 6. Let's see. And for a couple more myths, looks like, and some more questions at the end. Okay, so the 6th and the 7th myth are ordered in my book for a strategic reason. The 6th story that ends up being false is that Copernicus, he sort of demoted humans from a place of importance in the center. And the 7th myth has to do with kind of what the striving of humanity to find significance in the midst of this supposed demotion by science. All right, let's look at the supposed demotion by Copernicus. The late new atheist Christopher Hitchens once said that Christianity's greatest failure was to oppose the Copernican theory, and that supposedly they did this because they didn't want humans to be dethroned from being at rest in the center of the universe. And this is the way astronomy textbooks typically express it, that we were torn from the throne at the center. Well, to understand the real history, you have to go back to pre-Christian times, to Aristotle's time, living about 3.5 centuries before Christ. Aristotle conceived of the universe as having two major parts. The part in what looks like an archery set here with the bullseye, where earth there in the middle, and then water and air and fire. These four elements, as Aristotle conceived them, were made up what he called the terrestrial region, or the sub-lunar region of the universe, that is below the moon. And then from the moon all the way up to the fixed stars, which were thought to be the outermost physical sphere. Beyond that was what he called the unmoved mover that supposedly energized the whole thing. But Aristotle thought of the planets, the superlunar, from the moon on up. That part of the universe was totally incorruptible, whereas the earth, water, fire, and air, they interact with each other, these elements, and things come into existence. And as these elements disassemble, things fall apart. So you have generation and corruption happening in the central part of the universe, and in the non-central part of the universe, that's the superior, that's part of the universe. It's up there. It's the exalted heavens, the incorruptible heavens. Now that's the ancient view that made its way through the Middle Ages up to the time of Copernicus in the early modern period. So the center of the universe is not the place of privilege. It's the bottom of the universe. Up in the heavens, that's the place of privilege and honor. Just the reverse of the way the myth goes. The Demotion Myth says we used to be in the privileged center, and then, or at least thought to be there, and Copernicus came up with a theory to show, at least give some evidence that we were not in that privileged center, that we were up, we were decentered, and that was somehow humiliating, and showed that we couldn't be the center of God's divine plan for the universe. But early Copernicans, showing this historic background that debunks the myth, early Copernicans presented their Copernican view as a promotion, not a demotion. For example, Galileo once wrote, "I will prove that the Earth does have motion." Now, he didn't actually prove it, but he tried to. He gave some arguments. He says he's going to argue for a moving Earth, and that the Earth is not the sump where the universe's filth and ephemera collect. In other words, it's not the place of generation and corruption in the middle of the universe. The Earth is now conceived to be up high. We've joined the dance of the stars. This is a promotion, as Galileo frames it for his audience, which still had this traditional way of thinking of the different places in the universe that they inherited from Aristotle. Kepler took this even further. He argued that we couldn't remain at rest in the center because God wanted us to, because of the contemplation, scientific contemplation, for which man was created, which includes measuring distances to planets like Venus. So in the diagram there on the screen, you see a way you can use the assumption of a moving Earth having an orbit that's larger than the orbit of Venus. So you see the orbit of Earth is larger than Venus's orbit, so it encompasses Venus's orbit. And if that is true, then you can draw a little triangle at certain key moments, and then based on the angles of this triangle and known distances, you can calculate the unknown distance, which is how far Venus is from the sun relative to how far Earth is from the sun. So this basic trigonometric procedure could only be possible in this way if Earth is a moving object, a platform of observation designed for scientific discovery. In fact, some of you may have heard of the book that came out about 15 years ago called The Privileged Planet, which argues that the universe was designed for discovery. Well, Kepler, one of the most famous scientists along with Copernicus and Galileo, actually made this privileged planet argument back in the early modern period. And he used it to argue for a Copernican view. That is, it's more likely, he argued, that God would have made Earth to be a moving platform because it's better for science than if Earth were stuck in the dead center, because it enables you to make discoveries that you otherwise wouldn't be able to make. So that's an interesting thing. Copernicus himself didn't think of his view as a demotion. He thought the universe was created for our sake. Doesn't sound like a demotion to me. But notice how this Copernican demotion story gets extended. This astronomy textbook says that humanity has been relegated to an unremarkable position on the periphery of the Milky Way Galaxy. Yes, now we're looking at the galactic level rather than the solar system level. Okay, in the solar system level, of course, Earth is not in the center, the sun is. On the galactic level, within our own galaxy, we're not in the center of the galaxy. We're about halfway out, depending on how you define the edge of the galaxy. So, of course, the same astronomy textbook that tries to continue this demotion story acknowledges it on other pages in the same textbook that really the center of the galaxy is not a place of privilege. It's totally uninhabitable. Too much cosmic radiation, and for various other reasons, you couldn't have a habitable planet in the center of a galaxy. That our position in the galaxy actually is remarkable compared to most other positions. There's only a small percentage of places in the galaxy that are habitable, where you could have a solar system with a habitable planet. So it's like they're wanting it both ways. They want to continue telling the demotion story, but they're also, of course, have to be honest about what contemporary scientific evidence is showing us. So this shows you how the bad history of science can actually distort contemporary science, like in this textbook example. Okay. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson has a preface in this other widely used astronomy, college-level astronomy textbook called The Cosmic Perspective. And Tyson kind of has this, the cosmic perspective is kind of his trademark sort of preaching platform, where he likes to say that the cosmic perspective says that the universe is not a benevolent cradle designed to nurture life, but a lonely, hazardous place. Now notice, he's saying that life is very rare in the universe. Most places in the cosmos are uninhabitable. Now, remember, C.S. Lewis went through all the options, and this is one of the options, which happens to be the best supported by evidence, that Earth is very, very rare. Habitable planets are very rare. And notice how Tyson wants to spin this as an argument against a benevolent God who designed the universe for life. He wants to say, because life is so rare, therefore God didn't do well, it doesn't make sense that a God would have made a universe that's so hazardous to life in most places. But of course, we've already run through this. That's just atheist rhetoric. It's not really a good argument for a godless view of the world. But Tyson, on the one hand, he wants to say we've been demoted, where we don't have the childish view that everything revolves around us. On the one hand, he wants to say that, but he also, after talking about these demotions, he also wants to say there's something special about us and about our view of our ability to know the world. He's through the cosmic perspective, which is science, right? He says the cosmic perspective is spiritual, even redemptive, but not religious. That scientists have a sense of awe on the face of nature, because the cosmos is our heavenly parent. Now, it redeems us, he claims, because it redeems us from religious ignorance and religious dogma, that that there's a designing intelligence out there that loves and it cares for us. He just thinks that we're evolved stardust, but we know that we're evolved stardust. We've figured this out through science, therefore we are significant after all. But a lot of people aren't really content with saying humans are significant simply because they can do science. And many have lately have been trying to fill this significance void left by this demotion story that is pervasive in astronomy textbooks. They're trying to fill it with the new kind of promotion. And I'll quote, and this new promotion is identified as my seventh myth, the Extraterrestrial Enlightenment myth. And here's a NASA-funded book. Okay, your tax dollars at work. NASA says in this book, this one essay by a NASA scientist in this book says that Copernicus demoted us, but it's time for a promotion. How? Well, because because of his belief in undirected cosmocultural evolution that produces intelligent beings throughout the cosmos on those rare planets. But if the universe is so big, there's going to be a lot of those rare planets eventually that we, and so this, and he expresses belief in what he calls unlimited significance of super intelligent extraterrestrial life that if we come in contact with could save us from our own ignorance and save us from self-destruction through nuclear holocaust. So I call this the ET Enlightenment myth. And it's the idea that, well, Richard Dawkins believes in this myth, that ET, if it were to arrive on Earth, would have technology that would be indistinguishable from magic. And not only would they be technologically superior to us to the point that it would look like they're performing miracles when they aren't, but they would be morally and spiritually superior to us because they survived the adolescence of their own civilizations. They didn't annihilate each other with nuclear bombs and rose to a level of morality that was far exceeds human morality, because there's a lot of nasty things that happen on Earth, as you well know. And so ET, many of these Enlightenment myth believers think that ET might come as super intelligent robots rather than biological life. But in my book, I show how people like Rodney Brooks, who's one of the founding fathers of the AI industry at MIT, he critiques this this wild sort of story about the future. This is a futuristic myth that's rooted in science fiction literature, as I show in my book. But what Rodney Brooks finds questionable about this idea that technology could become so advanced, especially through artificial intelligence, that one day the machines will wake up and become conscious. You know, the Force awakens, right? And the problem is that he identifies is that this is just storytelling. It's to say that technology can become indistinguishable from magic, then it's no longer a falsifiable worldview. It's you would, if any kind of creature were to appear on Earth that appeared supernatural, they would just say, "Oh, it's natural. It's just advanced technology." I mean, look, they had to make the trip here, and we all know that even possibly habitable planets are really, really far away. So their technology and their ability to survive their own self-destruction must have been so superior that now here they are. They found us on Earth, and here's the way Dawkins puts it. He believes that aliens have advanced to the point of being godlike in ways that exceed anything a theologian could possibly imagine. That's what he said in his book, The God Delusion. Now, what's really weird about this is here we have an atheist who is opening up the expectation that maybe in our own lifetime we will finally meet ET, and that it will be a godlike creature that will solve human problems and lead us to a higher spirituality. Of course, a spirituality that has nothing to do with traditional religions like Christianity, where you have the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ, but it will be alien life that will be our savior. Now, let's just do a little thought experiment here. Let's suppose that, let's just imagine that one day, maybe in your lifetime, maybe not, let's suppose that one day a creature appears on the planet that looks like it's doing supernatural things, you know, and it's solving world problems and brings peace and prosperity. Now, atheists really, like Dawkins, because of the quote I just read you, really can't help people distinguish it. Let's say people are who are on the fence. Is this an actual naturalistic alien? Is this an alien that evolved through natural processes and now it just looks supernatural, but it's really natural? Or is this actually a supernatural creature who's trying to maybe even deceive us? Well, atheists really, given their own storytelling, their futuristic mythical storytelling, really can't help people distinguish anymore between the natural and the supernatural. And I find this extremely ironic that in these latter days, atheism has opened up people to even occult-like openness to, you know, maybe even private visitations from aliens that would appear supernatural, and they would just say, "Oh, it's just natural," and not really critically evaluate whether this creature is natural or supernatural. I think Christians should be open to both. Well, anybody should be open to both, either interpretation. It could be an alien creature, it could be a supernatural creature posing as an alien, perhaps to try to deceive most of the world. Now here's evidence against this myth. That is, if you're open to both interpretations, the natural and the supernatural interpretation of whatever this creature is, or creatures, then one thing you would have to keep in mind in evaluating the naturalistic interpretation, that is, it's just an alien, not a supernatural creature, is that it's very unlikely that we would ever have contact in the sense of an alien actually arriving on the planet, because habitable planets are so extremely rare. And to date, Earth is the only one that meets all the long list of characteristics needed for a habitable planet, that is, for a complex life that could be intelligent. So, so actual contact is very unlikely. That's what we know based on science. And what about communication? Remote communication, even this is very unlikely because of the vast distances and the speed limit, the cosmic speed limit, the speed of light, limits travel and communication both. And so it's very unlikely we would have any kind of meaningful two-way communication at a distance because of the rarity of habitable planets and the vast distances and the cosmic speed limits that limit travel and communication. So these are just different scientific components that make if there were to be someday a very boastful creature arriving on the planet, or creatures claiming that they're solving problems, and that the traditional religions are bunk, that they don't believe in God either, and that we should enter, a higher form of spirituality that gets rid of these old tribal gods like Yahweh and so forth. Well, this ET salvation story sounds scientific in many ways, but it really isn't. It's a futuristic myth. And you have to keep in mind several things to debunk the myth. First, technology can't overcome natural laws. So now they'll say, well, they're not overcoming natural laws. The technology is so advanced, it looks like that. But keep in mind, technology can never overcome natural laws. And that epistemologically, this modern atheism is eroding at the ability to distinguish anymore between the natural and the supernatural, between obvious natural things we see in front of us, as well as the possibility of supernatural beings. And the claim that the ET superhero will be so morally superior that we should follow all of its advice is really not based on atheism. Morality is just an illusion. It's just your genes are tricking you to do things that help you to reproduce and to carry your genes on to the next generation. That's how atheists describe morality. There really is no true moral categories of good and evil. It's just pragmatic. So anyway, I think that this ET salvation story is really interesting because again, even skeptic Michael Shermer says that any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence is indistinguishable from God. And I would say he should be a little more skeptical about his own ideas, because this is another expression of the ET Enlightenment myth. But anyway, I think that I will end with this supreme irony that godless philosophy expects a godlike ET to show up, and that this is making atheism and the occult be harder and harder to distinguish. And that's what I talk about in my book, Unbelievable. So, more questions?
Yes, more questions. Thank you so much for your talk, by the way. So, what do you think of Reasons to Believe's position that the Bible's scientific statements are correct? For example, the claim made in Isaiah that the universe is expanding.
That they claim what?
This wasn't a specific question, this is something we came upon, but the claim in Isaiah that the universe is expanding.
Expanding, yeah. Well, again, I don't think that the Holy Spirit intended to teach about an expanding universe. I think there's good evidence for expanding universe, but we know this through scientific inquiry, not through biblical exegesis, not through interpreting the Bible. The Bible, I don't think, was intended to teach that. And again, I would go to C. John Collins' book, Reading Genesis Well, if you want a very lengthy, very scholarly answer to that. And he was the chair of the ESV, English Standard Version, Old Testament Committee. So he's a leading Hebrew scholar. Next question.
Next question. Many Christians struggle with where to draw the line in the Bible regarding what to interpret literally or figuratively. Would you say this is a subjective and personal process? If not, what rules govern drawing the lines for Christianity as a whole?
Right. You know, I used to teach a course in hermeneutics to undergraduates at Southwestern Seminary who they were preparing to become very graduate level seminary students. And I taught hermeneutics, that is which is the science and art of interpretation accurately, because as a historian of science, I have to interpret texts, and as a philosopher of science, I reflect on hermeneutical principles. And it's not just subjective. Now, postmodernist thought tries to say that that the reader can respond any way they want, and that there is no true authorial intent that is discernible in any text. But of course, that kind of self-implodes, doesn't it? Because the very literature that they publish, the postmodernists publish, they're claiming to tell you things that you're supposed to believe in, right? And yet their own view of text undermines their own texts. Anyway, so postmodernism self-implodes, by the way, for that reason. But no, I think there are, when you look at scripture, you would use some of the same principles you would use for interpreting any ancient text. You look at the grammar, you do word studies, you look at historical background. What did words mean in this cultural context at this particular time when this was written? What would the audience originally have understood by the use of these words, by the use of this kind of literature, using these words, and so on. So there's all kinds of objective principles that go into interpreting text that ordinary historians use, even if they're not historians of religion, just historians of politics and everything else. Historians use these tools, and biblical interpretation uses those same basic tools. Now, there's additional considerations when it comes to the biblical text because it's inspired by the Holy Spirit. We know that what God intended to teach is in the text, and it's just up to us to accurately interpret it. Now, when it comes to literal versus non-literal, I think it's more helpful to talk about accurate versus inaccurate approaches to interpreting the text. An accurate interpretation of the text will take into account the literal meaning of words, but also words are sometimes used for metaphorical purposes. Now, if there's a metaphorical device in a text of scripture, that doesn't mean you can just make it mean whatever you want it to mean. There still is an objective hermeneutical procedure for finding the most likely reason that, let's say, Isaiah used a certain figure of speech to communicate something about God's revelation to humans about what he expects of us, or what the future holds, or how God made the world, or things like that. So it's not just anything goes, and I think, but I think that, so if you would say, do I believe that everything should be interpreted literally? Of course not. No one really believes that. But we want to interpret the Bible accurately, which includes consideration of the kind of literature it is, and then the details of history and grammar and syntax and all that. So there you go.
Awesome. Next question. Does the ET myth suggest a readiness within modern atheism to worship and welcome powers/beasts as described mysteriously in Revelation?
Yes, I figured several of you would be making that connection. There's many different ways that the enemy could pull off massive worldwide deception. This is just one possible way. So I don't claim, I'm a historian and a philosopher and a science teacher, not a prophet. So I don't know that Satan would necessarily use this way, but it's what I find fascinating is I came across this myth not by pouring through the book of Revelation. I came to this recognition of a myth, this futuristic myth, by reading atheist literature, and that this is what they're expecting. Could Satan use these cultural resources to deceive the world? Of course he could. And that's already in place. He could use it because you could have people of widely different worldviews, religious and non-religious, agreeing that we should follow this creature or beast or whatever, and give up traditional religion and faith and get an upgrade to our religion that will leave behind these narrow-minded terrestrial religions and enter a new cosmic age of religion. And I think that atheists and people of many different religions might buy into together. Now, Christianity, I think, will be the odd man out here, especially because of the doctrine of the incarnation, and of course, the Book of Revelation does set us up to see that there may be a deception like this that would where Satan could appear as being like our Savior. And could actually solve many world. The demons and Satan, of course, have immense amount of knowledge that could be used to solve a lot of world problems, but at a great cost. But they could look like aliens. So yeah, I think that is a possibility. But of course, how actually Satan pulls this off, nobody knows, except God and perhaps Satan.
Great. Next question. A lot of modern atheists' perspective sounds bizarre, and I have a hard time imagining atheists that I know actually feeling that it's credible. Do you know to what extent these perspectives have worked their way to the common person?
Yeah, well, I have been working on, in fact, I'm just starting to work on an essay on the ET myth for a book, and trying to look at how these pronouncements from, let's say, Dawkins or Michael Shermer, how does this get into the common, popular culture? Well, you have some of this already in sci-fi movies. Sort of this, look, when aliens show up, if aliens were to show up, there's two logical possibilities. They're they might be nice, they might be really nasty, right? But so science fiction as a genre does explore a lot of these things imaginatively, and of course I argue in my book that people like Dawkins and Shermer are engaged in a kind of myth making, not in the sense of just blatantly false statements, but telling a story that has some factual components, but projecting into the future in a way that sets people up for to interpret the world in a certain sort of way, particularly a non-theistic way. And I think science fiction has been a very powerful cultural tool for some of these ideas to get into common discourse. And as far as the serious expectation of a godlike creature that's just an alien, I think that yeah, I'm currently researching just how much of this is discussed, in more popular culture. So I can't answer it for sure, but I have a feeling that it is becoming more and more pervasive.
Okay, so next question. You mentioned how the church got some things wrong with its treatment of Galileo, even though the story is more complicated than often portrayed. How can modern day religion avoid making the same mistakes in future scientific exploration?
Right. Well, the contemporary equivalent to the moving Earth versus stationary Earth controversy of the 17th century would be within the evangelical church, old Earth versus young Earth, or old universe standard chronology versus a young Earth reading of the scriptures. And I think what you can do is you can extract some lessons from the Galileo affair and say, we just need to be patient with these kinds of issues where some people see an apparent conflict between a majority viewpoint in science and scripture, and they want to push for a minority viewpoint in science, in this case, a young Earth perspective, which is a very, very tiny slice of scientists. Very, very few scientists believe in that. But minority viewpoints aren't necessarily false. Galileo wasn't a minority. But sometimes the minority is in the minority for good reasons, because there's more evidence for the majority viewpoint. It could go either way, of course. So you have to take this on a case-by-case basis, and I think be open to where the evidence leads. I think the evidence leads in this particular issue to an old universe, and I think it's entirely consistent with the Bible. So I think that as a case, the Galileo affair, I think there's a lot of important lessons to apply to the contemporary debate over an older and a young Earth. And it goes back to the hermeneutical question of earlier. There are rigorous ways of interpreting the text. There's still going to be some disagreement about what the text means, but at least we can eliminate some of the obvious errors. And I say, let's be patient with the biblical scholarship. Let's be patient with the science. Eventually, as both biblical scholarship and scientific scholarship progress, I think if they're done well without biases that skew the data, you're going to find that both forms of God's revelation cohere. The general revelation that we can see through science and the special revelation through scriptural interpretation.
Great. Excuse me. Next question. Are you familiar with Ilya Delio's concept of cyborg Christian, in which humans evolved to incorporate AI? Do you think this is possible?
Yeah, in my Extraterrestrial Enlightenment Myth chapter in my book, I do have a section on AI. AI can do some really cool things, but I think that, and if you're a materialist, you already believe that material stuff already became conscious at least once. Humans, here we are, right? We're conscious. And if humans came here through an unguided material process, then material stuff got more and more complicated to the point where it woke up, right? If it happened once, why couldn't it happen twice, thrice, or more? So the whole AI becoming conscious, where computers wake up and they become persons of a sort. That's a futuristic myth, and it gets most of its traction by just assuming the naturalistic worldview. The AI experts like Rodney Brooks, who I quoted in an earlier slide, have good reasons to doubt this. And I quote a whole bunch of other AI leaders who don't believe in what's called the singularity. That is, that at one point, even in Earth's technology, the computers will wake up and become persons and become superhuman. And whether that involves partly human, partly mechanical, cyborg, with that. Well, the point is, there is a natural limit to what we can get computers to do. Now, I think that the most promising progress in AI is better and better collaboration between actual intelligence, human intelligence, and so-called artificial intelligence. I think this interaction between the two will become more and more sophisticated with some amazing results, but not in the mythic sense of computers becoming like our gods and becoming so super intelligent that we will need to bow down before them.
Awesome. In Humans 2.0 by Fuz Rana, transhumanism is presented as the major competitor to Christianity. What do you think of this? Are people like Elon Musk setting the stage?
Oh, I think there's a lot to that. Again, if you accept the materialist story, transhumanism would be just the next stage in cosmocultural evolution. Remember that quote from the NASA publication? It's not just biological evolution that they believe in, for reasons that aren't really well supported, as you know from, let's say, Steve Meyer's books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, and his new one coming out next month, The Return of the God Hypothesis, which I highly recommend. I've already read it and wrote a blurb that might appear on the back of the cover. Again, the title of that book is the Return of the God Hypothesis, where it deals a lot with science and religion issues. But yeah, transhumanism is a beguiling futuristic story. It's for people that, if you don't believe in God, at least it gives you something to hope for, that maybe we could transcend some of the limits that we currently have as humans, and we could save ourselves. Or maybe ET will come and give us the technology that allows us to engage in, to upload our minds to computers and have some sort of conditional immortality as long as the hardware keeps running. But in the end, I think these are not well grounded in what we actually know about what machines can do and what computers operating in those machines can do. But yeah, transhumanism is a kind of alternative religion. So I agree that it is an up and coming alternative to a theistic viewpoint.
All right, Dr. Keas, I think we have run out of time for questions, but thank you very much for your presentation and for addressing those questions with us today. We really appreciate your time and your energy. So thank you very much.
This was actually not me. This is my artificially intelligent me. I just got plugged in.
Very good.
No, it's been fun to be with you
Appreciate
guys.
it. Thank you very much. Before we take a break, before the panel, we would like to announce our two winners. So the winner of our copy of the 7 Myths about the History and Future of Science and Religion book that we're giving away is Jessica Cheney. So congratulations, Jessica, for that. We'll make sure that we get that shipped to you. And then the winner of our $20 Giftogram gift card is Ralph Gurley. So thank you very much for attending. We will make sure to get those to you. We're going to take a brief break, and then at 2:30 we will reconvene, and we will be discussing a panel discussion with 3 scientists about the question, is it irrational for scientists to have faith? That will be a panel discussion, and like I said, we will get started at 2:30. So if you would like to hang in there with us to do that session as well, we would be happy to explore that topic with you. So thank you very much. We'll see you in a few minutes.